Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for tuning in to another episode of our CSEC lecture series. My name is Alexis McDavid, and I am an outreach officer at the Institute of Jamaica, and which is an agency of the Ministry of Culture. And my division is the National Museum Jamaica division. And today we have with us Jeanette Corniffe, who is a PhD candidate and assistant lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeological Department at the University of Mona campus, and she lectures in the areas of Caribbean women's and gender history, urban heritage of Jamaica, and 19th and 20th century North American history. Her research interests are social, legal, and economic history. So we just wanted to tell her thanks so much for coming in today to do this with us. This is a collaboration between IOJ and the History Department, and her theme is resistance and revolt. And the topic is insurrectionary and non-insurrectionary resistance methods of enslaved men and women in the British, French, and Spanish Caribbean. Thank you so much for coming in today, Jeanette.
You're most welcome.
And to get things started, let me pose a question to you. Can you please introduce us to the origin and purpose of the resistance methods employed by the enslaved people in the British, French, and Spanish Caribbean from the 16th to the 19th century?
That's a very long period of time, Alexis, and it must be emphasized that resistance did not begin in the Caribbean region. These individuals were captured in various parts of Western Africa, and they actually started to resist from the moment of capture. When they were being held in the barracoons before they were sent aboard the ships to be transported to the Americas, they were resisting as well. They resisted while they were coming, so that route referred to as the Middle Passage, they were resisting while they were traveling to the various territories in the Caribbean region. What we are primarily interested with, though, are the elements of resistance that were obvious when they arrived or after they arrived in the Caribbean region. So we're talking about acts of resistance on the plantations, on the pens, or for those slaves who were in urban areas, what they were doing in these urban areas. What we find is that the very nature of the slavery that they were exposed to, being chattels, they were dehumanized, and therefore this played a great role in determining the acts of resistance that they were engaged in. It is also very important to note that as we look from territory to territory, from region to region, the British, the French, the Spanish, the acts of resistance in many cases were very similar across the region. Whether it is that they were on the pens, on the plantations, or in the urban areas again, they were resisting in quite similar ways. Now, notions of freedom which they harbored in their minds and scars which were clearly etched in their bodies from the treatment that was meted out to them fueled these acts of resistance. And I want us to understand that both men and women who were being oppressed, they asserted their right to either improve their daily life. So some persons were interested in ameliorating their circumstances, not necessarily intending on overthrowing the system of slavery, but then others were clearly in it for the long haul. They just wanted this thing to be done away with. It is also very important to note that both enslaved men and women participated to a significant extent with regards to resisting slavery. And they did this via two very important categories. We traditionally it was said that these two categories were active and passive. Those terms are dated. We now say that they resisted by insurrectionary means and by non-insurrectionary means. The non-insurrectionary means are the ways in which they resisted in primarily non-violent ways. And when we talk about the insurrectionary means of resistance, we're talking about those acts of resistance that involved some degree of violence, sometimes a lot of violence. The methods that they employed proved effective. Men were very much engaged, or more so than women, in the insurrectionary acts, but we find that women were involved too. With regards to the day-to-day acts of resistance, men were involved, and we also see women playing a significant role here as well. So it is very obvious that both genders and persons of all different ages were involved in these insurrectionary and non-insurrectionary acts of resistance.
Jeanette, you can please describe in a little bit more, please, some of the non-insurrectionary forms of resistance that was successfully carried out by the enslaved?
Oh, there were so many of them. If you think about it, it may seem very simple, but many of them just turned up late for work. Just imagine having to drag yourself out because you really didn't want to go, not being paid, treated badly, etc. In addition to this, some of them actually withdrew their labor. In some cases, they refused to work, engage in strike action. Can you believe it? These slaves, or enslaved people rather, were engaged in strike actions. Sometimes they just worked slowly, so they were not being as productive as they could have been. They faked ignorance, so they got instructions and they pretended not to understand. This eventually ended up wasting the planters' valuable time. In addition to that, they were deliberately careless in instances. So they would have been wasting plantation supplies, and they were extremely quarrelsome, particularly the women. It is said that they were extremely quarrelsome, they used indecent language, etc. Matthew Lewis, who actually was a plantation owner in Westmoreland, Jamaica, he stated, "Every morning my agent informs me some fresh instance of insubordination. It seems this morning the women, one and all, refused to carry away the trash, and that without the slightest pretense. In consequence, the mill was obliged to be stopped, and when the driver on that station insisted on their doing their duty, a little fierce young devil flew at his throat, endeavored to strangle him. The agent was obliged to be called in, and at length this petticoat rebellion was subdued." So this is an example of the types of resistance that the planters met with on a daily basis. The overseers, the bookkeepers, they met with these acts of resistance on a daily basis. I want to point out Elizabeth Fenwick, who actually was a white woman in Barbados who employed slaves. So she never necessarily owned, she employed some. And they frustrated her in her household. It was as if the lady was tearing out her hair with the frustration that came along with the relations that she had with these enslaved people. In some cases, these enslaved people also lodged complaints against their owners and overseers. They were punished in some cases for doing this, but this didn't stop them. They were knowledgeable, for example, regarding allowances that they were supposed to get. Meat, clothes. They knew how long they were supposed to be working. They knew the downtime that pregnant women were supposed to have gotten. And when some of this was not coming their way, then they rebelled. For example, a complaint was lodged in court in April 1823, and this was a complaint lodged by 18 slaves from Dallas Castle Plantation in Port Royal. The majority of them, by the way, women, and they complained to the magistrate that the overseer, one Mr. Stevens, he was not treating the slaves as well as they should have been treated legally. He was tried and he was actually found guilty of lashing 2 of these women more than they should have. So they got more lashes than they were legally supposed to have gotten. And the court fined him 20 pounds for each one of these ladies that he was accused of overlashing. In other instances, they pretended to be sick, so they feigned sickness. they mocked the enslavers. They had all these satirical songs, etc., that they just sang around them, particularly the women in the fields. And many of these white employees were not aware of what was going on, because the mother tongue from Africa was being mixed with the English that they were learning, and therefore it made it hard to figure out sometimes what they were saying. They mutilated themselves. For example, having an injury on your arm, a slave would probably, in some cases, they actually did put dirt in it. So they made it worse. They wanted more downtime, more time off. And this, in some cases, it would appear as if, they were really desperate. But we can understand, based on the treatment that they received during the slavery plantation era. In some cases, they overstarched their masters' best suits. So they spited them. They stole food, they stole items of clothing, etc. And with regards to clothing, this was another element in the resistance that some persons really took to a different level. It is believed in some parts of West Africa that if you wear the clothes of your enemy, the spirit of the enemy is weakened, and you are then wearing the spirit of the brothers, and then they are weakened. So as a result of this belief, they would steal clothes. In some cases, when persons were running away, they would also steal clothes, because they then could disguise themselves to look as if they were freed black people, because clothes was used to differentiate persons in the society in some regards. A slave was not expected to be able to afford a certain kind of clothing. It's also important to note that some of these enslaved women took advantage of the sexual relationships that they had with their enslavers. Fibber is one such person. She was owned by Thomas Tisloud. He actually was engaged in a sexual relationship with Fibber for about 33 years. And this relationship, some persons say it was sexploitation. According to Trevor Bernard, in explaining Fibber's relationship with Thomas Tisloud, he says, and I quote, "A minority of women managed to not only survive enslavement, but also transcend its limitations easily. The most remarkable slave encountered in Tisloud's diaries was his long-term mistress, Fibber. What is most remarkable about her is how skillfully she was able to exploit her relationship with Tisloud to gain personal advantage and social benefits for the entire slave community. Fibber was able to transcend slaves' powerlessness through her privileged position as a mistress of a white man, a position that enabled her to purchase property, advance the social status of herself and her family, and engage with Tisloud on a more equal basis than was possible for any other slave. And in doing so, she undermined the principle of black subordination and weakened assumptions of white dominance," end quote. These are some of the ways in which these women resisted.
Okay. Jeanette, you can elaborate some more on the significance of these gynecological acts of resistance within this period under investigation that we're talking about now?
Gynecological acts of resistance, these elements were extremely important. And these are elements that were peculiar to women because they were both producers. They made up the majority of the workers in the fields, but they were also reproducers. So they were expected to reproduce, that is basically give birth to children who would then form another generation of slaves who were owned by these enslavers. And this is important because children took the status of their mother. So if the mother was enslaved, the child was automatically enslaved at birth. Now, with regards to these gynecological elements of resistance, women in some cases exaggerated menstrual discomfort. So they pretended to be in more pain than they were in some cases, because we really can't tell. They utilized birth control methods. They committed abortions. They terminated their pregnancies, and they had various bush remedies that they used for this. The peacock flower, they utilized the cassava, savin juniper, etc. Basically, women resisted by exercising control over their wombs. Matthew Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, who was quite vocal with regards to these issues, he said, and I quote, "I believe that the negresses can produce children at pleasure, and where they are barren, it is just as hens will frequently not lay eggs on shipboard because they do not like their situation." Now, while the tasks allocated to these pregnant women, in some cases, and the types of punishments meted out to them negatively affected their fertility rates, some women simply were not able to reproduce because of the bad treatment that they got. Others just said, "I am not doing this." So they exercised that amount of control. With regards to other elements of gynecological resistance, they also delayed weaning, and this impacted their ability to get pregnant. This is something that many of them knew, and they therefore used. It is important for me to point out also that in some cases it may not have been that they were resisting, but they were used to this extended weaning period in their communities in Western Africa. But this was foreign to the Europeans. It was longer than the period that they were accustomed to. It's also important to note that they killed their babies in some instances. They committed infanticide. So in 1796, for example, Mary Thomas of Barbados was accused, along with her mother and her sister, of killing her newborn baby. And that was extremely hurtful, because this was another potential enslaved person who could have contributed to the productivity of the slave plantation system. I also want to point out that some planters, actually realizing the significance of the productive capacity, the reproductive capacity of these women, they started implementing pronatalist strategies from the latter part of the 1700s. So we see some of the measures that were implemented in the 1790s in Jamaica and in the Leeward Islands, for example. In Jamaica in 1792, women who had at least 6 children were by law exempted from what was referred to as hard labor. In 1798 in the Leeward Islands, according to their slave code, women who were at least 5 months pregnant could only be asked to do what was considered as light work. Importantly also, they created lying-in houses where women would go to deliver these babies. And this was important also for planters who believed that many of these women were actually going to the midwives among them, who were helping them to ensure that the child either was born dead or died soon after it was born. After 1807, this became even more important, because in 1807 there was the abolition of the British Atlantic trade in slaves.
In relation to the retention of the African-derived culture, what were some of the ways in which enslaved men and women preserved their African culture, and why was this significant?
It was extremely significant if we consider some of the retentions that are currently elements in our Caribbean culture. We realize that this is so. It also empowered them. Very, very important in empowering them as well. But what were some of these cultural forms that they retained, that they held on to, even when the planters were trying to wrest this from them? They held on to names. So we still have examples of African names. They held on to their language. They held on to religion. And we see where Obia and, for example, Voodoo played significant roles in other elements of resistance. For example, Nani, she was said to be an Obia woman. And during the Haitian Revolution, Bootman, for example, is said to have delved into Obia in order to gain success in that encounter. They also used their herbal remedies. Again, this can be linked to the abortions that were carried out. Anansi stories. In some cases, dances were permitted. In some cases, they were not. Drumming, this was considered something that should not have been done because it was believed by some of these planters, and rightly so, that they communicated with each other via the various drums and the beats. It's very important to note also that not only did they practice these, but they ensured that these cultural forms were retained, so they passed them on to the next generation. The planters really depended on women to socialize the next generation, and these women, mothers, and in some cases superannuated females who would have been in charge of, say, the picnic gang on the plantations, they ensured that they were teaching them these stories, teaching them the proverbs, teaching them the dances, etc. So they did play a very important role in ensuring that these enslaved individuals maintained these elements of their culture. And because these were so near and dear to them, they tried all that they could to ensure that they resisted attempts to take these elements of their culture away from them. Members of the planter class tried to suppress these elements, but the individuals in the various territories, the enslaved individuals, they ensured that they did what they had to do. So whether it was in Dominica or in Cuba, where they held secret dances, which secret because they were outlawed, members of the enslaved community ensured that they were participating in these acts of resistance. Now, according to John Thornton, and this is very important with regards to the fact that so many of these elements have survived, he said, whatever the brutalities of the Middle Passage or slave life, it was not going to cause the African-born to forget their mother language or change their ideas about beauty in design or music. Nor will it cause them to abandon the ideological underpinnings of religion or ethics, not on the arrival in America, not ever in their lives. So they resisted fiercely by holding on to what they considered truly theirs.
Okay, well, thank you so much for elaborating on those points for non-insurrectionary resistance. Can you give us or explain, please, some of the insurrectionary forms of resistance now that was carried out by the enslaved?
There were quite a number of insurrectionary acts of resistance as well. We are familiar with the revolts, the rebellions. Those come to mind very quickly, and it's so easy to pick these up in the historiography, particularly the traditional historiography. But we also consider the fact that they murdered their enslavers or employees of their of plantation owners. They were also engaged in marronage or running away. They killed the livestock and they committed arson. With regards to murder, or in some cases it was attempted murder of some of these enslavers, in July 1840, a slave in Cuba actually killed his mayoral in a quarrel. He was punished because he refused to work. He had suffered an injury a few days earlier, and therefore he was having some pains in his body. The mayoral decided to whip him because he, as was common, many of these individuals just thought that blacks were just lazy. He killed him, and he did not stop there. He was joined by about 50 others on this same coffee plantation who went ahead and found the planter, found the owner, and killed him too. This was very important. In some cases, the children of owners, their employers, etc., these were the ones who were targeted by these enslaved individuals. And in many cases, domestic slaves were the ones who would have done this because they had access to the meals of these individuals, So, for example, Minetta, a 15-year-old girl, was found guilty of attempting to poison her master. In addition to that, we can look at marronage, and there are several categories, two main ones, petite and grande. With regards to petite marronage, it was primarily short-term absence from the plantation or from the estate or from the lodging house in the urban area, etc. In quite a number of cases, persons just left to go and meet up with their lovers, but they would have come back. And in many cases, they were punished. But some of them just continued running away. With regards to grand marronage, we have several examples of this long-term, permanent type of running away and establishing freedom elsewhere. And we have maroon communities in territories such as Jamaica and Dominica, and also in Cuba. Now, runaways were mostly men, but this does not or should not give us the impression that children, women, persons who were ill, etc., did not attempt to run away, and some successfully. 6-year-old Sally, for example, ran away to find her mother. Mothers with young children actually ran away as well. And then there was somebody like Cuba, who was considered an incorrigible runaway because she just kept doing it over and over and over, regardless of how she was punished when she came back or when she was captured. It is also very important to note that some of these individuals within the enslaved community, they harbored fugitives. And this was necessary because if you were running away, having somebody to hide you was extremely essential to your success in the long term. I have an image here, and it indicates the number of persons who would have been reported as having run away, and this was in 1833 in Barbados. And we can see from this information here, from this table, that most of those persons who ran away in fact were men, but clearly women were seriously accounted for as well. And then there were the rebellions, the Haitian Revolution, the Christmas Rebellion or Baptist War in Jamaica, one in Demerara in 1823. There were so many, Bossas Rebellion. And we take note of the fact that both men and women, it has to be emphasized, were involved in these acts of insurrection. With regards to the men, in Puerto Rico, there was the Grito de Laras insurrection, and this was in 1868. It was organized by a man. In Jamaica, the Sam Sharp Rebellion, 1831-32. Again, Samuel Sharp, Baptist deacon, he was the leader of this rebellion. In 1816, Bossa was actually, he's a national hero of Barbados. He was primarily responsible for that rebellion in 1816. With regards to the Haitian Revolution, we think about individuals such as Toussaint Louverture, and we think about Boukman Doty, who was actually from Jamaica, ended up in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue at that point in time. He was a voodoo priest, he was a maroon, and these men just played very, very significant roles in these insurrectionary acts of resistance. And specifically, in this case here, we're talking about these riots, these rebellions.
Okay, so you just mentioned a long list of names of men who participated, and traditionally men are noted as the ones who resisted slavery by insurrectionary means. Is this because women did not participate in insurrectionary forms of resistance, such as murder and armed rebellion? Like, what's up with that? So did women participate?
They did. As a matter of fact, with regards to the rebellion in Barbados in 1816, that Bossa was so significantly involved in, Nanny Grigg She participated as well. She was very much involved in what was happening there. In addition to that, Nanny of the Maroons, during the 1730s, before the conclusion of the peace treaty with her group of, with her followers in the eastern part of Jamaica, or even before the conclusion of the treaty with the Maroons in the western part of the island, she was known for armed resistance against the British. Her band of Maroons was one of those bands that seriously frustrated the efforts of the British to effectively settle the island of Jamaica. As a Maroon chief and religious leader, she was both feared and revered. Very, very important. And we have heard so many stories about Nanny and the powers that she had, the powers that she exercised, etc. When we think about Guadeloupe in 1802, Solitude, also a Maroon warrior who escaped to the mountains during the turmoil in the 1790s, going back to the revolution in Saint-Domingue here. While she was pregnant, she was involved in this act of resistance. Because in 1802, Napoleon attempted to reintroduce slavery in Guadeloupe, as he did in Saint-Domingue, in Martinique, etc. And she fought. They failed because it was reintroduced and eventually outlawed, came to an end in 1848. But she played a significant role here. So significant that she was found guilty and they decided they had to kill her. Her execution was stayed because she was pregnant, but they executed her a day after she gave birth because of how significant her contribution was. When we consider the Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica, 1831, over into 1832, women did play significant roles as well. For example, they supplied water to the rebels. They led them to provision grounds. They guarded captives. They acted as a lookout, for example. So they were actively involved in this rebellion, in this rebellious activity that were this particular rebellion that was taking place. In Cuba in 1843, Carlota is famous for her resistance to slavery. She led a rebellion in Matanzas and is actually considered as one of the pioneers in women's fight against slavery. Extremely important. Women were involved in insurrectionary acts of resistance. This was not solely the domain of men.
To what extent can it be accurately concluded that enslaved men and women participated in undermining the system of slavery via both insurrectionary and non-insurrectionary acts of resistance?
Traditionally, historians have focused on the insurrectionary acts of resistance a whole lot more than the non-insurrectionary types or formats. But it has come to light so much more that the non-insurrectionary acts of resistance, things that persons were doing day in, day out, in the fields, in the great houses, in the urban areas, that these played a significant role in undermining the system of slavery. It did. The planters were getting less productivity. That was important because that was affecting their profit margin. They were being frustrated. And therefore, we have to consider that, yes, the rebellions, they played a significant role. And if we think, for example, about the Sam Sharp Rebellion, 1831-32, so close to the Emancipation Act of 1833, and considered to be very significant, a very significant occurrence with regards to the lead up to the termination of the system of slavery. So that was very good. All well and good for the insurrectionary methods. But the non-insurrectionary methods, they must be taken into consideration and across the Caribbean region. British, French, Spanish, and even other areas of the Caribbean, either other regions. So both insurrectionary and non-insurrectionary forms of resistance, which were employed by both men and women in the Caribbean, contributed in varying degrees to undermining the system of slavery and ultimately led to its destruction throughout the entire region at the various points at which it came to an end, from country to country, from region to region.
Well, thank you so much, Jeanette, for sitting down with us today and talking about resistance and revolt. And I just want to say to everyone, please follow and subscribe us to the History and Archaeological Department's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook pages, as well as the National Museum Jamaica social media pages. Again, we just cannot thank Jeanette Corniffe again for coming in today. We really appreciate it. And everyone, just stay safe and please stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you and bye.